It has often occurred to me that the most extraordinary cases in which I had the privilege of accompanying my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, began in the most ordinary fashion. A quiet breakfast at Baker Street, a knock at the door, or a nervous visitor with an impossible tale. Such humble beginnings frequently concealed mysteries that challenged reason itself. The affair of the locked room murder was perhaps the finest example. It was on a cold November morning in 1895 that Holmes sat opposite me, lazily examining the morning newspapers while clouds of tobacco smoke drifted toward the ceiling. There is a curious absence of imagination in London's criminals, Watson, he remarked. Forgery, theft, blackmail. They repeat themselves endlessly. You almost sound disappointed, I replied. I am. At that precise moment, Mrs. Hudson entered the sitting room. A gentleman insists upon seeing you at once, Mr. Holmes. A tall man in his 60s hurried inside. His expensive overcoat was soaked by the rain, and his hands trembled visibly. My name is Sir Reginald Ashcombe, he said. I beg your forgiveness for arriving without an appointment. Holmes motioned him towards the chair. You have experienced a severe shock within the last hour. The gentleman stared in astonishment. How could you possibly know that? Holmes smiled faintly. The mud on your left trouser leg has dried, while the mud upon your shoes remains wet. You fell to one knee some time ago, but continued walking afterward. Your shaking hands complete the picture. Sir Reginald sank into the chair. My younger brother Edward has been murdered. Holmes leaned forward. Murdered? Inside his study. Go on. The room was locked from the inside. Holmes's eyes brightened immediately. The windows? Locked. The fireplace? Far too narrow. Who discovered the body? The servants. They broke the door down. And the murderer? Sir Reginald lowered his voice. There was no one else inside. Holmes glanced toward me, and I knew that familiar spark had returned to his eyes. At last, he had found a mystery worthy of his talents. Less than an hour later, we were traveling toward Ashcombe Manor with Inspector Lestrade, waiting for us upon arrival. The manor stood alone among ancient oak trees beneath a gloomy November sky. Lestrade greeted Holmes with a tired smile. I expected you'd come. You have an impossible murder, Lestrade? I've got one I can't explain. Excellent, Holmes replied. We entered the study. Edward Ashcombe lay beside his writing desk with a single bullet wound through the heart. A revolver rested near his right hand. Suicide would seem obvious, Lestrade said, except the doctor found powder burns on the victim's coat but none upon his hands. Holmes crouched silently beside the body before rising to inspect the room. The door had been bolted from the inside. Lestrade demonstrated the broken lock that had been forced by the servants. Every window was securely fastened. Holmes examined each latch personally. The fireplace was much too narrow for any grown man to pass through, and the chimney was thick with untouched soot. There were no secret passages, no footprints, no rope, and no sign that anyone had escaped. It appeared to be the perfect locked room murder. Holmes slowly crossed the carpet until he suddenly knelt. He picked up something almost invisible. Blue sand, he murmured. Lestrade frowned. Sand? There isn't any nearby. Holmes carefully sealed the tiny grain inside an envelope without another word. On the writing desk lay a half-finished letter. If anything should happen to me, the truth is hidden. The sentence ended abruptly. The pen had rolled across the desk, and the ink had barely dried before death interrupted the writer. Holmes then turned toward the fireplace. Interesting, he whispered. Using the poker, he carefully searched the ashes until he recovered a tiny fragment of melted brass. He slipped it into another envelope before examining the bookshelves. His gaze lingered there much longer than expected. Finally, he removed several books and studied the dusty shelves behind them. Watson, he said quietly, what do you notice? I looked closely. At first I saw nothing unusual. Then I realized one rectangular patch of wood was perfectly clean while the surrounding shelves were coated with years of dust. A book is missing, I said. Holmes nodded. And someone considered that missing volume more valuable than diamonds. Before anyone could speak again, a constable burst into the room. "Inspector, we found another body." Every face turned toward him. "Where?" Lestrade demanded. "The gardener's cottage." We hurried across the estate. Inside the small cottage lay the old gardener, dead only minutes before. There was no visible wound, no weapon, and no sign of struggle. Yet across the whitewashed wall, written in fresh blood, were 6 chilling words. The door was never locked. The journey back to Ashcombe Manor was made in almost complete silence. Lestrade appeared increasingly frustrated, while I could see from Holmes's expression that his mind had already begun assembling the scattered pieces of the puzzle. He walked directly into the study once more without a word. This time, however, he ignored the body entirely. Instead, he examined the broken lock again, measuring it carefully with his pocket rule before crouching beside the doorframe. "Curious," he murmured. "Very curious indeed." Lestrade sighed impatiently. "You keep saying that, Holmes. Would you care to explain what exactly is curious?" Holmes stood and dusted off his sleeves. "Because everyone has accepted the same assumption without questioning it." "Which assumption?" "That this room was truly locked." Lestrade frowned. "The servants had to break the door down." "Precisely. Yet no one has asked whether it had been locked before they attempted to open it." I stared at him in confusion. "Surely the broken bolt proves it." Holmes smiled faintly. "Not necessarily, Watson." He stepped into the hallway and carefully examined the splintered wood surrounding the lock. "Notice these marks." I leaned closer. There were 2 separate cracks in the frame. One was fresh and pale, while another beneath it appeared older and darker. Holmes pointed with his cane. "The bolt had damaged this frame weeks ago. The final blow merely enlarged an existing fracture. The servants believed they forced open a locked door because they expected it to be locked." Lestrade folded his arms. "If it wasn't locked, why didn't it open?" Holmes turned the brass doorknob slowly. "Because the swollen wood had jammed after the rain. They mistook a stuck door for a locked one." Silence filled the corridor. It was such a simple explanation that none of us had even considered it. "Good heavens," I whispered. "Then the murderer simply walked out." "Exactly." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "The impossible murder has just become possible." Lestrade looked unconvinced. "That still doesn't explain why no one saw him." "Not yet." Holmes returned to the study and carefully measured the distance between the fireplace and the writing desk. He then examined the ashes once again before retrieving the tiny piece of melted brass from his envelope. "Watson," he said, "do you recall the peculiar brass tube used by stage magicians to fire blank charges?" "Vaguely." "This fragment belonged to something very similar." "Meaning?" "The murderer burned part of his apparatus after using it." Lestrade raised an eyebrow. "Apparatus?" Holmes nodded. "Mr. Ashcombe was shot from several feet away, yet powder burns appeared upon his coat. That contradiction bothered me immediately. I felt a sudden realization. The powder wasn't produced by the revolver." Holmes smiled. "Precisely. The murderer used a separate device to scatter burned powder across the victim's clothing after the fatal shot had already been fired. He wished us to believe the revolver had been discharged at close range." Lestrade stared at the melted brass fragment in Holmes's hand. "And he destroyed the device afterward." "In the fireplace?" Holmes replied. "An elegant attempt, though unfortunately incomplete." We next questioned every servant again. Holmes ignored their opinions and focused entirely upon tiny observations they had dismissed as unimportant. One maid recalled smelling lavender perfume immediately after hearing the gunshot. Another remembered seeing blue dust upon the visitor's boots. The cook insisted the mysterious gentleman had entered carrying nothing at all, despite the rain outside. Holmes wrote every detail into his notebook without comment. As we prepared to leave, Holmes suddenly stopped before an old grandfather clock in the entrance hall. He listened carefully to its ticking before opening the wooden case beneath the pendulum. Hidden inside was a folded sheet of paper. Lestrade looked astonished. "How on earth did you know to look there?" Holmes unfolded the paper. "Because the clock loses exactly 3 minutes every hour, yet no one in this meticulous household had repaired it. Someone had been opening this case repeatedly." The paper contained only a list of names and dates. Most meant nothing to me. One, however, stood out immediately. Professor Julian Mercer. Holmes read the name twice before slipping the paper into his pocket. Do you know him? I asked. Very well. Who is he? One of the finest mechanical engineers in England. Brilliant, and completely without conscience. Lestrade looked puzzled. What's his connection to Ashcombe? That, Holmes replied, quietly, is precisely what we must discover. Late that evening, we visited Mercer's London residence only to find the house abandoned. Furniture remained exactly where it belonged, but every drawer had been emptied and every document removed. The murderer carried it unknowingly upon his boots. We searched the entire office until Holmes stopped before a large iron safe hidden behind a portrait. The safe stood open. Every document inside had been removed except for a single page. Across the top appeared the title, Project Janus. Below it were dozens of names belonging to politicians, judges, businessmen, and members of parliament. Beside each name was a payment amount. Lestrade's eyes widened. Bribery. Holmes shook his head. Blackmail. I looked closer. Each name was followed by the title of a book and a page number. Books? Holmes smiled. Not books, Watson. Codes. Suddenly, everything became clear. Ashcombe and Mercer had created a publishing company solely to distribute coded messages between members of a criminal organization. The missing volume was not valuable because of its words, but because every page contained the key to deciphering their communications. Edward Ashcombe had apparently decided to betray the organization. Before he could reveal the code, someone silenced him forever. Then Sir Reginald was taken because he knows where the missing book is, I said. Precisely, Holmes replied. At that moment, a young messenger arrived carrying a sealed envelope addressed to Sherlock Holmes. Inside was a railway ticket and a handwritten note. Come alone if you wish to see Sir Reginald alive. Midnight, Blackstone Station. Burn this note. Lestrade immediately objected. It's a trap. Holmes folded the letter calmly. Naturally. Then you cannot possibly go. Holmes smiled. My dear Lestrade, when a criminal believes he controls the board, he often overlooks the simplest move. Midnight found us concealed inside an abandoned warehouse overlooking Blackstone Station. Holmes had ignored the instruction to come alone. Lestrade hid his officers outside while I remained beside Holmes on an iron walkway above the platform. A single lantern burned beneath us. At exactly 12 o'clock, a carriage arrived. 2 men stepped out, leading Sir Reginald with his hands tied. Moments later, another figure emerged from the shadows. Professor Julian Mercer. Holmes, he called. I knew you'd come. Holmes stepped into the light. You flatter yourself, Professor. Mercer laughed softly. You solved the locked room faster than I expected. It was never locked. Quite true. Mercer nodded approvingly. Most investigators waste their lives chasing impossible explanations while ignoring ordinary ones. Holmes folded his arms. You murdered Edward because he intended to expose Project Janus. He became sentimental. And the gardener? Mercer's expression darkened. He witnessed my escape. Holmes looked steadily into the man's eyes. There is one thing I never understood. Mercer smiled. Ask. Why leave me clues? The professor laughed. Because I wanted to know whether Sherlock Holmes truly deserved his reputation. Holmes's answer came instantly. Vanity has destroyed greater men than you. Mercer's smile vanished. He reached slowly inside his coat. Lestrade shouted, Police! Don't move! Officers rushed from every direction. Mercer drew a revolver, but before he could fire, Holmes struck his wrist with a perfectly aimed blow from his cane. The weapon clattered across the platform. Within seconds, Mercer was surrounded and handcuffed. Sir Reginald was freed unharmed. As dawn broke over London, we returned to Baker Street. Lestrade shook Holmes's hand warmly. Another impossible mystery explained. Holmes smiled as he filled his pipe. There are very few impossible crimes, Lestrade. There are only impossible assumptions. After the inspector departed, I asked the one question that still troubled me. Holmes, when did you truly know Mercer was the murderer? My friend leaned back in his chair. The moment I entered the study. Before the blue sand? Before the brass fragment? Yes. How? Holmes pointed toward the writing desk. The unfinished letter ended with the words, The truth is hidden. Every investigator assumed Edward was describing a place. I realized he was describing a person. Mercer had hidden the truth behind books, codes, and impossible illusions all his life. Edward died before he could finish writing the man's name. Holmes closed his eyes as the first rays of sunlight entered Baker Street. Remember this, Watson. Whenever a mystery appears impossible, do not ask what cannot happen. Ask instead which assumption everyone has accepted without question. It was advice I never forgot. Of all the remarkable adventures I shared with Sherlock Holmes, none demonstrated the power of reason more perfectly than the affair history would remember as the impossible locked room murder.